I'll turn you over to our Federal Policy Director, Kermit Kaliba.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Sylvia, for that introduction. Thanks, everybody, for dialing in on a chilly Thursday afternoon for our update on what's happening here in Washington around federal workforce and education policies. I'm pleased to be joined today by my colleague, Katie Spiker, our Senior Federal Policy Analyst. And we're hoping to talk through some of the key issues that are impacting federal education and workforce policies here in Washington, and also hopefully provide a little bit of a preview of some of the key issues that we see emerging in 2018. Before we get started, I think it's we have the opportunity to work with a lot of great partners out in the state and local levels who are doing great work every day in helping individuals get the skills and credentials they need to succeed in the labor market, and helping businesses find the skilled workforce that they need in order to be successful. And I want to just say thank you to all of the many people who I know are on the call and out in the field who have been helping us out with making sure that we bring these issues to the attention of policymakers in the administration, in Congress, and elsewhere. I think we've been very successful in keeping the issue of skills and investing in skills on the radar for a number of policymakers, and we couldn't be doing the work that we do without you. And so I want to make sure to say that up front. I know that 2017 has been kind of an unusual year, an interesting year here in Washington, and so I want to say thank you to everyone for all the hard work and the energy that folks have been putting into this issue. So when we talk to folks in the field, a lot of times people ask me what's happening in Washington. Is anything happening in Washington? And the reality is that there is actually a great deal of policy activity that's happening here in DC, both in the administration and on Capitol Hill. And so we're going to try to touch on a bunch of different issues. We're not going to go into really deep dives on any of these particular issues, although as Sylvia mentioned, you have the opportunity to submit questions as part of the webinar. We'll try to leave enough time at the end of the webinar to answer some of those questions. If we don't get time to answer all of the questions that folks have, we'll do our best to try to do a written Q&A document, FAQ document after the webinar, and send that out to folks. And if folks have specific questions that we don't answer as part of this webinar, we will also provide our email addresses at the end of this webinar. So please feel free to shoot us an email, and we'll do our best to get back to anyone who has detailed questions that we don't get to. So the topics that we're going to try to cover today, we want to talk a little bit about what's happening with the fiscal year 2018 appropriations process. We're kind of coming up on the end game, we think, of the FY18 spending process. We're going to so Katie is going to talk us through what's been proposed so far in terms of education and workforce funding levels, and what we think is going to happen heading into early next year. We'll talk a little bit about the tax reform conversation that's happening in Washington, and where we think that conversation is going. The tax reform bill that's under consideration right now has potentially some direct impacts on education and workforce programs, but also some potential indirect impacts that we'll want to talk about. We'll talk about the apprenticeship process, and the apprenticeship remains a very hot topic here in Washington, both with the Trump administration and on Capitol Hill. And so we can talk a little bit about what we're seeing, both with the executive order that the president released over the summer, and then some of the legislative proposals that are out there. Then we'll talk about the Higher Education Act and the Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, two pieces of legislation that have seen significant action on the House side, but have not seen as much action on the Senate side. And we could talk a little bit about what we're expecting on the Senate side next year. Last but not least, we'll talk about some possible legislative activity next year around the Farm Bill, which would impact the SNAP Employment and Training Program, or SNAP ENT. I know many states and many practitioners have been working with SNAP ENT as part of their overall funding strategy for skills in the states and in the local areas. And we can also talk a little bit about the welfare reform conversation that we think is likely to begin in earnest when we get back from the holidays in January and February. So those are the topics that we're going to try to cover. Like I said, we're not going to do a deep dive on everything, but we'll try to get to the highlights. And also we want to share a little bit about some of the work that we've been trying to do with our state and local partners to impact these conversations, some of the bipartisan support that we've been able to get around specific policies and specific practices. So we'll highlight those as we go through each of these topics. Okay, so before we do the topic, we dive into these topics, I think just it'd be helpful to sort of do a little bit of a 30,000-foot overview of the landscape here in Washington. And I think, you know, the place to start, the thing to remember is that we came into this year, when we started in January, we began with what was a relatively uncommon situation where we had unified one-party control of both the White House and Congress. This is the first time that we've had this situation in Washington since the early days of the Obama administration. And that has had some significant impacts on the policy conversations that we're seeing here in DC. Probably the most important thing to know about this particular political landscape is that when you have unified party control of both the White House and Congress, it makes it easier to use a budget tool called reconciliation. And I'm sure many folks on the phone are familiar with this term by now. We've been hearing it a lot this year. Reconciliation is a special procedural tool that allows for legislation to be passed without needing to meet the 60-vote threshold to avoid a filibuster in the Senate. So it allows for passage of legislation on a simple majority, both on the House side and then the Senate side. And what that means is that because this tool is available, congressional leadership, Speaker Paul Ryan on the House side, and then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell from Kentucky decided relatively early on that they would really try to focus, at least in the initial part of this year, on using this reconciliation tool to advance some significant policy priorities for the Republican Party. So as folks may recall, we spent a very significant portion of the first part of this year on healthcare with the effort to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, and then we're right now in what looks like the final stages of another reconciliation conversation around tax reform. Now, one of the consequences of this focus on reconciliation and the unexpected challenges that came up around the healthcare repeal and replace conversation is that there hasn't really been a lot of time in Washington for other legislative priorities. So folks may remember the healthcare conversation. There was an expectation that it would move relatively quickly this year, but it ended up taking almost into the fall in order before that effort fell apart. And so that meant that there wasn't time on the legislative calendar for many other priorities. So a lot of things that congressional leaders have been hoping to work on, like the Farm Bill, like higher education, like the Perkins Act and others, there just hasn't been time in the legislative calendar to get to those issues. And so I think it means there's likely to be a little bit of a window once we complete the tax reform conversation in the early part of next year, where there's potentially going to be some impetus on trying to move some other pieces of legislation that didn't get to come up earlier this year. And certainly we've been getting signals from Congress and from some of the committee leaders that they would like to see some of their priorities move in the early part of next year. Obviously, the other thing that's happened because of this focus on reconciliation is that it's really sharpened the partisan divide in Washington. You know, one of the the points of reconciliation is that you can move things without any bipartisan support, but then that means that it's when you do need to get bipartisan support on other legislation, it can make things a little bit more difficult. So so certainly this is one of the dynamics that we're going to be watching, particularly as we head into the end of year budget conversations, and some of the other conversations that we're going to be talking about is how easy will it be to build bipartisan support for these issues, given some of the relationships that we've seen evolve over the past year. Another thing to just keep in mind as we think about the legislative landscape is that that we've seen a relatively slow process in filling some key roles within the administration. So, for example, the Employment and Training Administration of the Department of Labor is the agency that's responsible for the implementation of Title I and other other programs under WIOA. We still don't have an assistant secretary in charge of that agency. We also don't have an assistant secretary for the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education at the Department of Education, which is the agency that or the department that manages adult education, career and technical education, and other programs. And that's important because it means that the White House has not had as much of a role in establishing and moving priorities in some of the key issues that folks on the phone are interested in. That doesn't mean that the administration doesn't have positions on workforce and education programs, but they've been less well equipped to kind of move, to work with Congress to move some of those conversations forward. Now, all of that having been said, skills are and remain a bipartisan issue, and I think that one of the things we're going to try to highlight over the course of the rest of this webinar is where we see some continued opportunities for bipartisan agreement, and hopefully as we move into 2018, we'll see some opportunities to move some good policy forward in the skills arena. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Katie to talk a little bit about where we are with the appropriations process.
Thanks, Kermit. So like Kermit said, it's been a busy year for skills in DC, and Congress continues their work this year to fund many of those programs that folks on the phone prioritize. It's kind of to start this process, Congress enacted a continuing resolution in September that funded the government at current year levels through December 8th, and then passed another short-term continuing resolution to fund the government through December 22nd. So they're still working on the longer-term funding bill that would fund the government for fiscal year 2018. Just today, the House Appropriations Committee released a bill that would fund the Pentagon for the full year and would include a shorter continuing resolution for all other programs just through January 19th. The Senate's not anticipated to take up that bill, and it sounds like another short-term CR through mid-January is the most likely to give policymakers time to reach an agreement, so another month to reach that agreement. In President Trump's proposed budget for FY 2018, he proposed some pretty steep cuts to workforce and education training programs. So he proposed a $2.5 billion or 21% cut to WIOA formula grants and a $9 billion cut to Department of Education's budget, including a 15% cut to Perkins, 16% cut to adult basic education state grants, and he proposed a cut of $194 billion over 10 years to SNAP and $2.2 billion in cuts to TANF. Moving to the next slide, Congress didn't quite accept this extreme of cuts in their proposals that we saw out of both the House and the Senate, but skills programs would still take a hit under the House proposal in particular. So the House proposal would cut formula grants for WIOA by 3% and eliminate Title III funding, and it wouldn't include the funding that we've seen for the past couple of years for apprenticeship. The House also would rescind $3.3 billion in Pell funding. The Senate version of the funding bill for the next year would largely maintain current funding levels for WIOA programs, but it would rescind $2.6 billion from Pell and increase the max award slightly. So as policymakers really get down to the wire on the latest continuing resolution, reaching agreement about the next funding levels is complicated by a few factors. So sequestration era budget caps are still in effect right now. The For the past few years, the Congress has come to 2-year budget agreements that's allowed these caps that were implemented in the Budget Control Act to be raised so that programs could have, so they could appropriate more money to skills program and across the appropriations process in general. And the latest version of that agreement expired this fall. So there still isn't an agreement on raising those cap levels to the level that we've seen funding at for the past few years. There's also been continuing negotiations around deferred action for childhood arrivals, or DACA. And Democrats had initially said as part of their negotiations around funding that they wouldn't pass any funding deal that didn't include a fix for DACA. It looks like they may be backing off a little bit on that, but it still remains, you know, another piece, just like some of the other issues that Kermit talked about at the beginning, that complicate the negotiations around where funding for workforce and education programs will be. Similarly with the partisan divide around some of the healthcare repeal efforts and tax reform, notably that those were done through the reconciliation process, whereas the funding bill needs 60 votes in the Senate. And so Democratic support, bipartisan support for whatever funding package they pass. Realistically, this means that the final funding package is likely to look more like the Senate version. So pretty even funding for WIOA programs, likely to include some of the other pieces that the House version left out. But it's still really important right now because nothing's written in stone, because there are so many pieces up in the air, that we're talking to our members of Congress about how vital these programs are to you, your community, local businesses. NSC works with a group of national organizations in our campaign to invest in America's workforce, and has sent up a number of letters communicating those priorities to Congress. And after this webinar, we'll be circulating a letter for folks across the country to sign on to, if you're able to sign on your organization. And we'll send that letter up next week, showing the breadth of organizations and the number of organizations that really support investing in workforce education and training programs. So I hope folks will keep their eye out for that, the link to sign on to that letter. And we'll share when they sign on, not just a sign on, but we'll also have a chance for you to share some of your personal stories around why these programs are important to you and to your community and to local businesses, so that we can use that as a tool to share and give real stories to what these funding levels would mean across the country. So on the next slide, just a little bit bigger picture as well. All these cuts that we're talking about, and even the level funding from the previous year, really comes in the context of drastic cuts over the past 2 decades. So WIOA has been cut by 43% since 2001. CTE programs have been cut by 34%. Adult education by 21% in that same time period. And so the message that we're trying to emphasize with policymakers is really that these cuts make it harder for folks to do the work that they're doing across the country, and it makes it harder for businesses and workers to get the skills that they need to compete. So I can answer any more in-depth questions in the Q&A period, and just a reminder that you can submit questions to me online, but I will turn it back over to Kermit to talk a little bit more about what's up with tax reform.
Oh, okay, thank you, Katie. And so the tax reform conversation is an active conversation right now here in Washington. We actually just got, it was just being reported earlier this morning that the House and Senate have come to an agreement, at least in principle, around a final tax reform bill or a tax overhaul bill. We have not yet seen legislative text for that legislation, although we're getting some indications about some of the key provisions that are and are not going to be included. Just stepping back for a second, I think some of the things that we're going to be watching for. So, you know, as with any other piece of legislation, the House had a tax reform bill that they passed back in November. The Senate passed a separate bill in earlier this month, and those bills were relatively different in some key ways, particularly as they impacted education and workforce. So the House bill included a number of provisions that would have impacted higher education and higher education students and higher education institutions. So there were a number of provisions around repealing the deductibility of student loan payments. There were provisions to reduce or to eliminate or change the tax treatment of tuition payments for graduate students. There was a proposal to fully repeal the work opportunity tax credit. The work opportunity tax credit is a provision that has been around in the tax code for the last 20 years and provides tax incentives for employers to hire individuals who are SNAP recipients, TANF recipients, veterans, disconnected youth, and others. There's a proposal to repeal what's called Section 127, which refers to employer-provided tuition assistance. So where companies are providing tuition assistance for their employees, those investments get special tax treatment under current law. The House bill proposed getting rid of Section 127 completely. And then there was also proposals to eliminate the lifelong learning credit, although the House bill would have maintained and made some slight changes to the American Opportunity Tax Credit, which was originally created during the Obama administration. The Senate bill did not include most of these major provisions around education and workforce, but that does not necessarily mean that those provisions won't be in a final bill. And so one of the things that we're going to be looking at as we see final text, hopefully tomorrow, is what were the final decisions. So the House and the Senate are now in what's called a conference committee, where they're discussing the two versions, the House version and the Senate version, and trying to reconcile them. One thing that's being reported is that the provision around the special tax treatment for tuition assistance for graduate students is not included in the final bill. So that's a good thing. But we haven't yet heard about WOTC or Section 127 or some of the other tax pieces. So that's something we'll be planning to update. We will provide updates on our blog, our policy blog, hopefully tomorrow or Monday, if folks are interested in sort of the nitty-gritty details around education and workforce provisions. So with the tax reform conversation, in addition to some of the specific provisions that impact workforce and education, there are also some longer-term concerns, and I think it's not clear how these are going to be resolved. One of the things that I think this is probably something of an unintended consequence, but nevertheless something that has emerged in the conversation, is that under the terms of the tax deals that are being considered by the House and the Senate, there's the likelihood that the loss of revenue from some of these tax cuts will trigger what's known as PayGo, and PayGo is short for pay as you go. It's a statutory requirement that in instances where Congress passes tax cuts and doesn't have offsetting revenue to pay for them, then that can trigger a set of automatic sequestration cuts to a range of mandatory programs. Mandatory programs are those programs that don't get annual appropriations as part of the appropriations process, but rather get automatic funding by virtue of the legislation by their authorizing legislation. Some of the programs that would be potentially impacted by this are the vocational rehabilitation program, which is a mandatory program. Depending on the final terms of the tax reform deal, there is the possibility that vocational rehabilitation state grants would be zeroed out. There's also the social services block grant is another program that would potentially be impacted if Congress doesn't act to waive these provisions. There are a number of mandatory spending programs that are exempt from the potential impact of PayGo. So TANF and SNAP in particular are generally exempt from the sequestration under PayGo. Medicaid is subject to some sequestration, but the cuts that are allowable under PayGo are capped at a certain percentage. So it's unclear what's going to happen. One of the things when the Senate was negotiating their final bill, one of the deals that was struck in order to get Senator Susan Collins from Maine to agree to support the Senate tax bill was that there would be a separate piece of legislation that would waive the statutory requirements of PayGo to avoid these cuts. However, it's something that cannot be done through the budget reconciliation process. It does require a separate piece of legislation in order to waive PayGo. So this is, going back to the end of your budget discussion that Katie was just talking about. This is another piece that may have to be dealt with as part of any continuing resolution or as part of some other legislation that Congress would have to pass. So this is something we're going to be watching. It is definitely a significant concern certainly for those programs that are going to be impacted. The other thing that's not a direct provision of the tax reform conversation, but definitely something that we're watching, is that because the overall tax bill that's under discussion is expected to increase the overall deficit by at least $1 trillion, possibly more, possibly less, depending on which estimate you're using, that it does create a political climate in which we expect congressional leaders to start to really focus on this idea of reforming mandatory entitlement programs, including programs like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, but also SNAP and housing programs and other means-tested public assistance programs as a way to offset some of the revenue loss, some of the deficit increases under this tax bill. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the welfare reform conversation in a bit, but I do think it's important to kind of keep in mind as we're watching the different moving parts in the political conversation that this does create a situation where there is going to be pressure particularly from fiscal conservatives, to try to offset some of the costs from these tax cuts by making changes to spending in other areas. So this is definitely something that we expect to be a significant conversation next year, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Let me turn it back over to Katie to talk about the apprenticeship.
Thanks, Kermit. Kind of flipping on the level of bipartisanship, much less contentious than tax reform or even funding, apprenticeship has been a really prominent bipartisan issue in DC this year. The president and the administration have signaled their prioritization of apprenticeship. Congress and members on both sides of the aisle have been working on information gathering and a number of pieces of legislation to expand apprenticeship. So starting with the administration's work, in June, the president issued an executive order on expanding apprenticeship. The executive order authorizes the Department of Labor to issue regulations on what they called, quote, industry-recognized apprenticeship. The administration is describing the system as parallel to the current registered apprenticeship system. Much of what the executive order included were tasks for how to create and structure that certified apprenticeship system. The executive order, to that end, established a task force on apprenticeship expansion, which includes 20 business labor education leaders, so the CEOs of Business Roundtable, Northrop Grumman, U.S. Chamber, Dow Chemical, the president of American Association of Community Colleges, of the Carpenters, North American Building Trade Unions, Urban League, the governors of South Dakota and Iowa, among others, are on that task force. And the group is tasked with making recommendations to the president about how to expand apprenticeship. Right as of now, they've had one kickoff meeting. It's not a lot of their other activity hasn't been made public if they've done much more. So it's really just at the beginning stages, but they're anticipated to have a report to the president with recommendations by early next year. And National Skills Coalition put out a set of recommendations you can find on our website about to the task force, to policymakers, to the administration, with priorities for this new system that we really got out of conversations from many of the folks on the phone. So the executive order also directs the Department of Labor to spend $100 million of H-1B funds to support this expansion of apprenticeship. And this is consistent with one of NSC's big priorities for the year in which we've been working, which in October, Representatives Bonamici, a Democrat from Oregon, and Ferguson, a Republican from Georgia, introduced the Partners Act, and partners would use the same funding to support industry and sector partnerships that are working to expand apprenticeship and work-based learning. So really supporting, bringing together the partners that are crucial in workforce and training programs and in the partnerships that you all are involved in, and that are also really crucial in expanding apprenticeship. So making sure that schools and the workforce system and these industry-led partnerships with small and medium-sized businesses are all working together to help develop apprenticeship programs that provide the kind of structured on-the-job learning, classroom opportunities, and that really meet what we know works about work-based learning programs. So we have an open action alert on our website's Action Center, where you can find a template letter to send to your members of Congress asking them to support the bill. So that's been one of the big priorities where we've been working recently. But the executive order also includes another piece outside of just apprenticeship, where it tasks federal agencies with evaluating current training programs and asks them to propose elimination of ineffective programs. So this just reinforces the conversation about funding and taxes that Kermit was saying was, will be some of the conversation around welfare reform, is that it's really important that Congress and that members of Congress right now know how important funding for many of these programs is to folks across the country. So like we said, we've seen historic disinvestment in workforce training and education programs. And on top of that, for the executive order to include a target at eliminating other workforce programs is troubling and concerning. And so I encourage folks to reach out to your members of Congress and really communicate how vital these programs are and how much the cuts or proposed elimination would hurt at the local level in businesses. So apprenticeship will continue to be an active issue on top of the task force and the funding to support the expansion of apprenticeship. It also tasks the Department of Labor to release guidance or regulations on how to implement this new certified apprenticeship system. And so we anticipate seeing those, if not soon, then at the beginning, if not this year, then at the beginning of next year. So we'll have better insight into where the administration's moving as far as how they're implementing this new system. There's also been a number of members of Congress who were involved both from National Apprenticeship Week earlier in November and beyond, kind of thinking about what this expanding apprenticeship system can look like, and how, particularly since there's been funding for apprenticeship in the past few years, what that funding should go to help support and expand apprenticeship. So I'll turn it back over to Kermit now.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Okay, so let's turn to the Higher Education Act and what's going on with this important piece of legislation. So the Higher Education Act, of course, is the nation's primary law governing post-secondary education, including funding for student financial assistance, Pell Grants, and student loans, and other forms of student assistance. Major funding source for institutional support for institutions across the country. The Higher Education Act was last reauthorized in 2008. That was the last time we had a full reauthorization of the law, although there were some significant changes that were made in 2010 as part of the as part of the last budget reconciliation cycle. The Higher Education Act, you know, I think that it's safe to say that the conversation around higher education has really changed a lot in the last 10 years. There's a growing concern about sort of the role that student debt is playing in impacting the ability of individuals to get the skills and the credentials that they need in order to be successful in the economy. As folks may recall, under the Obama administration, there was a real focus on program and school quality, including what were called the gainful employment regulations, which are intended to reduce access to student financial aid for institutions that, particularly for-profit institutions that were seen as having low student outcomes and high student default rates. There's also, I think, been a lot of a growing recognition that the post-secondary student landscape is changing pretty significantly, that a very significant percentage of today's college students don't look like the traditional college student, that we have a number of folks who are non-traditional in some way because they're working full-time, they're parenting, they're attending on a part-time basis, they're financially independent, and I think there's a growing and I think bipartisan recognition that we need to be updating our higher education policies to better reflect who today's college students are, and better reflecting the kinds of institutions that are in the higher education space, particularly as we've seen the emergence of best practices like career pathways and a greater focus on sub-baccalaureate credentials, associate degrees, and other short-term industry-recognized certificate programs. So where are we with Higher Education Act reauthorization? Well, we actually just got a bill on the House side, a major new reauthorization bill called the PROSPER Act. This was a bill that was introduced by Chairwoman Virginia Fox from North Carolina, the Chairwoman of the Education and Workforce Committee, and Congressman Brett Guthrie of Kentucky. The PROSPER Act is a full-fledged reauthorization bill. It is not a bipartisan bill, and it was not intended to be. It is very much intended to be a statement of principles from congressional Republicans, committee Republicans, on what they would like to see around Higher Education Act reauthorization. And so some of the key sort of the overarching features of the bill is a real focus on streamlining and consolidation of the current financial aid system. So it incorporates what Chairwoman Fox is calling one grant, one loan, one work study. So it eliminates, for the most part, all federal student aid grants other than the current Pell Grant, and then it also consolidates or eliminates a number of the existing student loan programs, educational loan programs, and creates a single loan program called the ONE program that would be available to students who are participating in Title IV institutions. The other major sort of overarching theme is a real effort to push back on the regulatory legacy of the Obama administration. So there's a number of provisions, for example, repealing the gainful employment regulation and prohibiting the Department of Education from reissuing those regulations. There's a prohibition or there's a repeal of some regulation around the definition of the credit hour that were issued in the last administration, and a provision that would largely prohibit the Secretary of Education from issuing new regulations in the higher education space unless that's specifically authorized or required under the PROSPER Act. So, and that reflects a sort of a larger theme that we're seeing in Congress right now around the Department of Education, where there's been a real emphasis on limiting the authority of the Secretary of Education to issue new regulations in whether it's in K-12 education, higher education, or other spaces. Now, that said, there are a few things that are probably worth noting from a workforce perspective, and I should say Chairwoman Fox is very clear that she sees the PROSPER Act as a way to better align the current higher education system with the needs of today's workforce. So a couple of things that are worth noting and that we're going to be keeping an eye on as the higher education conversation goes on. So one thing that's worth noting is the creation of a new set of apprenticeship grants. This would authorize $183 million over 5 years for partnerships between institutions of higher education and businesses to establish earn and learn programs. So they wouldn't have to be apprenticeship programs. They could be other programs that allow individuals to gain some sort of credential or education while also receiving a wage. It's the language around these partnerships is not quite as clear as we would have hoped. I think there's some confusing language in there about how earn and learn programs or on-the-job training programs are being defined. But I will say it is in some respects it is consistent with with priorities that National Skills Coalition has around expanding investments in partnerships between institutions of higher education and local employers. And so we're certainly pleased to see that there was funding provided for these partnerships. We're planning to work with the committee and certainly as the conversation shifts to the Senate side to try to strengthen the language to make sure that there's clarity around the quality of these partnerships and the types of activities that can be covered. I mentioned that there's a very significant restructuring of financial aid. One of the major restructuring, major changes is a change in the definition of eligible programs. As folks may know, National Skills Coalition has advocated for expanded access for Pell Grants to shorter-term occupational programs that help individuals transition quickly into the labor market. The PROSPER Act does include changes that would shorten the time requirements for eligible programs for student aid. So under current law, eligible programs generally have to be 600 hours over 15 weeks. The PROSPER Act would change this requirement to 300 hours over 10 weeks. And it would apply to both Pell Grants and student loan programs, which is a pretty significant expansion. It also would expand eligibility to competency-based programs, which are programs that don't use a time-based system. They measure competencies and learning and help students move more quickly to credential by demonstrating competencies. This is a pretty significant change. There's a new definition of competency-based programs that we're still in the process of reviewing to determine whether or not it's the right definition. I know that a number of other national partners are weighing this as well. The PROSPER Act would make some changes to the ability to benefit provision that I know a number of folks on the line are using. The ability to benefit provision is the provision that allows individuals who don't have a high school diploma or equivalency to access Title IV financial aid. It eliminates the current requirement that ability to benefit students be enrolled in an eligible career pathway program. So would generally make it in some ways easier for these students to enroll in post-secondary education and access Title IV assistance. Although it's unfortunate that it does so by eliminating the reference to career pathway programs. We've done a lot of work with folks across the country who are implementing high quality career pathway programs that have shown a lot of success for low income and working adults. And so, and I think it's noteworthy that the PROSPER Act does not include the term career pathway anywhere in the legislation, which is unfortunate given the substantial progress that we've seen in this space over the past 10, 15 years. And then it also, the PROSPER Act also makes some changes to the federal work study program. Work study is a $1 billion program that has come under some fire in recent years because it has a relatively outdated funding formula that tends to favor older schools that were participating in the program back in the 60s and 70s, as opposed to focusing on students who are who have the most financial need. So this would change the formula a little bit to focus on enrollment of Pell Grant eligible students, and then would lift current prohibitions on the use of work-study dollars for private sector work placements. Currently, there's a fairly strict cap on the amount of work-study money that can be used for off-campus private sector job placements. This would lift that cap. So, there are some provisions in the Prosper Act that are certainly moving in the direction of making higher ed more responsive to the needs of employers and to working students. But I will say it doesn't quite go as far in some areas as we would like, and probably goes too far in others. And so we're certainly going to be talking to the committee, and hoping to work with our state and local partners to encourage Congress to, as this conversation moves forward, to change some of to modify some of these provisions to make them to make sure that we're focusing on quality, making sure that we're getting students into credentials of value, making sure that employers are getting credentials that respond to their needs. The Senate has not introduced a higher education reauthorization bill. There has been some discussion that they may try to introduce a draft bill in the first quarter of next year. But that said, it is given the sort of the political landscape, it is right now. It's going to be hard to get to 60 votes unless we see a real effort at bipartisanship around at the committee level. And certainly the Senate Help Committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee that's responsible for this bill has a tradition of bipartisanship, and there has been long term over the course of the many years. That's been a hallmark of that committee, and so we're hopeful that we'll see some bipartisan action on higher education. But as I say, it's difficult to predict what's going to happen moving forward. Let me move on to the Perkins Act just very briefly, and what's going on with that. So the Perkins Career and Technical Education Act is the nation's primary law governing career and technical education. It's about a $1.1 billion investment in secondary and post-secondary career and technical education programs. The Perkins Act has been kind of really a poster child for sort of bipartisanship and the bipartisan support that we've seen for skills here in Washington. So last Congress, back in 2016, the House Education and Workforce Committee actually had a bipartisan reauthorization bill that passed the House by a vote of 405 to 5, which, given the sort of the partisan climate, is really remarkable when you think about it. But it showed that there was a lot of support on both the Republican side and the Democratic side for strengthening and modernizing investments in career and technical education. Because of the lateness of that effort, because the House wasn't able to pass their bill until fall of last year, the Senate wasn't able to take up that legislation, and so the House had to reintroduce it earlier this year. They did reintroduce in the committee, and then it was passed through committee and actually passed on the House floor on a unanimous basis in May of this year. So again, reinforcing that there is some bipartisan support for investments in skills, and I think that this is a strong symbol of that. What's in the House bill? There are a number of provisions in the new House bill that I think are worth noting. Amongst other things, it calls for significantly updating the outcome metrics for post-secondary career and technical education programs to better align with the common measures under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. So that's for those institutions, post-secondary institutions that are receiving both Perkins dollars and WIOA dollars. I think that's an important step towards making it easier to align and offer programs that utilize both sets of funding. there's language in the Perkins Act in the House version that strongly supports the development and implementation of career pathways programs. Again, using the definition of that term under WIOA. That's also important for those institutions and partners that are offering or seeking to offer career pathways programs, having a common set of definitions about what the elements are of a career pathways program and who the partners are supposed to be, we think is an important step in the right direction. It calls for an increased role for employers in the development and implementation of career and technical education programs. It doesn't go quite as far as we would have hoped, but it does include the possibility of secondary and post-secondary CTE school providers working with industry and sector partnerships, which we think is a step in the right direction. And then it also would strengthen the connection between Perkins programs, both secondary and post-secondary programs, and state workforce planning processes under WIOA. So all of these, I think, are steps in the right direction towards making sure that Perkins funding and Perkins programs are better aligned with the workforce activities at the state and the local level. But as I say, and as I say, there's very strong bipartisan support for this on the House side. On the Senate side, we've sort of hit a roadblock, and this gets back to something I mentioned a little bit earlier when we were talking about the Higher Education Act. While there is, I think, very strong bipartisan support on the Senate side for moving some sort of Perkins reauthorization, in fact, there was a bipartisan letter that was signed by more than 60 senators that was sent to the Chairman Alexander and Ranking Member Patty Murray of the Health Committee a couple of months ago, strongly encouraging the committee to take up Perkins Act reauthorization. The committee has really been stalled over a dispute, again, over the role of the Secretary of Education. Committee Republicans have been pretty clear about wanting to include language that would limit the authority of the Secretary of Education to issue regulations on the implementation of Perkins outside of explicit statutory authority. Senate Committee Democrats have been concerned about these secretarial prohibitions, as they're called, because of concerns that may limit the ability of the Secretary to intervene if there are concerns about student outcomes or program quality. It's not clear if there's a path forward on this particular issue. I would also say that there have been some other concerns about the current funding formula for Perkins state formula grants, and the concern about particularly the funding allocations for states with lower population. So this is an area where I think there's a lot of folks here in Washington and in the states who have been talking to the Senate committee members, asking them to try to move this conversation forward and try to build on some of the progress in the House bill. So that's what's happening with Perkins. So last but not least, I'll talk about just a couple quick thoughts about the welfare reform conversation as it's kind of being referred to, and what we're expecting out of that. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, coming into this year, congressional leadership, Speaker Ryan and Majority Leader McConnell identified a set of policy priorities that they were particularly interested in trying to move through the reconciliation process. That's the process that allows you to avoid the filibuster in the Senate. So one of the things that we know has been on the agenda for a while now is the possibility of using the reconciliation process in 2018 to make some significant changes to mandatory spending programs, public entitlement programs, including Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, and others. It's not 100% clear what that reconciliation would look like. I think that's still something that's under discussion. But it is, but I know that we know that one of the things that's under consideration is thinking about how to expand or make or allow states to expand work requirements as a condition of benefit eligibility. So, you know, similar to programs like TANF and to a certain extent SNAP, establishing rules around individuals engaging in a certain number of hours of work and in certain work activities in order to receive benefit eligibility, in order to continue to receive benefits, whether it's Medicaid or SNAP or other programs. Again, it's not clear what mechanism congressional leadership is considering. This is something that we're monitoring very closely as we head into 2018, because we're definitely very concerned about the possibility of work requirements being expanded. Certainly, if in a situation where you could see a large number of individuals losing eligibility for public assistance benefits without any meaningful way to get the skills and the credentials that they need in order to be succeeding in the labor market and moving into family supporting jobs, so that they can transition off of public assistance into family supporting jobs. So this is definitely something that we're going to be watching. We just this week released a set of recommendations around for reauthorization of the SNAP Employment and Training Program, building on some of the lessons that we've learned from the last reauthorization of the Farm Bill, which made some pretty significant changes to SNAP employment and training. I should say that we've also been hearing some signals from the certainly the House and the Senate Agriculture committees that they are interested in taking up Farm Bill reauthorization, which would include reauthorization of the SNAP program and SNAP employment and training, and that there's a significant interest in trying to move the Farm Bill as a separate and apart from this broader welfare reform conversation in early 2018. So that's certainly a process that we're planning to monitor and work with congressional leaders to try to make sure that we're focusing on how we're helping individuals rather than focusing on outdated work requirements, instead focusing on how do we make sure that individuals who are on public assistance have access to high quality skills-based training programs that can help them succeed in the labor market, and also help employers find the skilled workers that they need in order to be successful in today's labor market. The other thing I'll mention, and then we can take a few questions, is there has also been a fair amount of reporting to indicate that the White House may release an executive order on welfare reform. Again, it's not clear what form that executive order will take, but I think what we're anticipating is some encouragement to agencies that do have jurisdiction over means-tested public assistance programs to find ways to encourage work from public assistance recipients, giving states flexibility, whether it's giving states the flexibility to add work requirements and other requirements, and also encouraging agencies to think of make public how they're moving more people into work through these public assistance programs. We know that the Department of Health and Human Services has been working with a number of states. For example, under the Medicaid program, we have a number of states that have submitted requests for waivers to Medicaid requirements to allow them to add work requirements as a condition of eligibility for Medicaid recipients, particularly for those who are considered able-bodied adults without dependents. And we're anticipating that at least some of those waivers that have been submitted will probably be approved in the next couple of months, which and we're also going to be monitoring that process and documenting some of the challenges and opportunities that we see as part of that process. So so I'm going to stop there, and then let's take a few questions, and then we can wrap up.
Yes. So we have a few questions. I encourage folks to send any last minute questions in in right now as well. We've got one process question, and then Kermit, I'll turn to you for a question on HEA and Prosper Act. So we've got a question asking about how to engage with NSC and how and what are some of the issues in which you hear from us. So I would encourage folks, I think in this slide deck, which you'll get after the webinar, you have both Kermit and my email address, but his is Kermit K at National Skills Coalition, and mine is Katie S. And so if there are issues in which you're hearing, conversation happening or things that you're not hearing from NSC on that you think we're probably working on or should be working on, I encourage you to reach out to us or other folks on staff. And our skills blog on our website, nationalskillscoalition.org, is also a place where we update with what new things that we've released, things in which we're working with policymakers. So I encourage folks to start there, and then also reach out to us if you have any questions or think that there's something in which we're not communicating with you that would be useful, or something from the work that you're doing that would be useful to us. So Kermit, we've also got another question on the Higher Education Act about kind of the broad range of issues that we saw in the House version of the reauthorization in the Prosper Act. And you talked a little bit about where you expect to see next steps in the Senate moving forward next year. But across kind of those issues, where do you see policymakers needing the most information from folks across the field? What do you see as some of the areas that there's the most capacity or desire for impact to change as the Senate takes up their version?
So that's thank you, Katie. That's a great question. So, as I'm sure many folks on the call know, National Skills Coalition released what we called our Skills for Good Jobs agenda back in November of 2016, and in that agenda we had identified a number of priorities for Higher Education Act reauthorization, particularly focusing on expanding financial aid to better assist working students and help connect to shorter-term occupational programs that are being offered at career and technical colleges, or community and technical colleges in particular, investing in partnerships between post-secondary institutions and employers, increasing student supports to help particularly non-traditional and disadvantaged students persist and complete in post-secondary education. And then last but not least, focusing on better program level data from eligible institutions to make sure that we know what the employment, earnings, and academic outcomes are for people who are participating in those programs. I think that the key thing that policymakers are interested in right now, there's a range of issues. The Higher Education Act is a very large piece of legislation. There's a lot of issues that are under discussion. But I think of particular interest for policymakers, for the folks who are on the call, is really helping to educate them on how institutions of higher education, whether it's community colleges or four-year institutions or others, are meeting the needs of working adults and other non-traditional students. I think there's a real appetite right now on Capitol Hill to hear what practices are effective in meeting the needs of working adults. I think there's a growing recognition. Policymakers are now starting to grasp that the student population in community and technical colleges and in four-year institutions has really changed from the sort of the traditional model, that not everybody is a first-time, full-time student coming right out of high school, that you have a lot of people who are going to post-secondary education in order to get credentials to help them advance in the labor market, and they're going at later times in life and dealing with family and employment obligations. So I think there's a lot of interest from policymakers in thinking about how they can better address that student population. We've certainly been working on a number of bipartisan proposals So for example, the Jobs Act, which was introduced earlier this year by Senator Kaine and Senator Portman, which would expand access to Pell Grants for short-term occupational programs that are offered in partnership with employers. There's also the College Transparency Act, which is a bipartisan piece of legislation that would improve data reporting for post-secondary institutions by allowing for program level reporting on employment and earnings and credential attainment and program completion for all students who enroll in those programs. And there are a number of other priorities. If folks visit our website, you can see some of the priorities that we've identified. But I think that the key message that policymakers want to hear right now is, what are the practices that are working for this population? How do we make sure that post-secondary programs are resulting in credentials that have value in the labor market? And what are the things that we need to do to strengthen partnerships, not just with employers, but also with other community stakeholders, adult education providers, community-based organizations, workforce boards, and others. So as this conversation moves forward, and I do think that the House bill is a starting point, it's not an end point. I think it's going to be important for policymakers to be, or for stakeholders at the state and the local level to be sharing their experiences and what's working and what's not.
Thanks, Kermit. So we've got a couple of questions also about funding and the impact of proposed cuts in the president's budget or sequestration. I'll let you add to a response, Kermit, and then I'll also say that we've got a number of other questions that are just coming in now. We're past 3:30, so we've got folks' emails because you signed up for the webinar. We can follow up with you. We've got a couple anonymous, so if you want to send a question in with your name so we can respond, we can do that as well. But I want to emphasize that that policymakers right now are working on both a budget agreement and a spending agreement, so that we're not anticipating sequestration to go into effect, and we're also not. Kermit also mentioned sequestration as a potential side effect under the tax reform conversation, also not expecting it to go into effect there. There's still space for folks to be communicating to your policymakers about how drastic and impactful it would be if those cuts did go into effect. But we are anticipating members on both sides of the aisle being supportive of an agreement that would raise sequestration level caps for the funding conversation, and that would not cause sequestration to go into effect under PayGo for the tax reform conversation. So it doesn't mean it's not still a possibility, but it's not likely, and policymakers are really working towards an agreement on that. It's just how much we'll see a raise of the caps under the budget deal and a potential budget deal and the funding conversation, and how much the labor and employment programs will get proportionally to other programs under that increase. So making sure that when we're communicating with policymakers, we're saying we need to raise the budget caps, and we also need to make sure that funding goes to workforce education and training programs proportional to those raised caps, so we continue to see investment in these vital programs. Kermit, I'll let you add anything to that you want to add and sign us off.
No, I don't. Nothing more to add to that. I will just say, so up here on our slide, in terms of what can you as advocates do. So as Katie mentioned, we'll be circulating an organizational sign-on letter asking Congress to ensure that we fund education and workforce programs at the levels that we need in order to stay economically competitive. That's going to be going out, if not today, then tomorrow. We really hope that as many organizations as possible will sign on so that we can send a clear message to Congress about the importance of investments in skills and making sure that that we continue to expand access to education and training for all workers and for all industries. I'll also say, and this is something that we always encourage folks to be doing, Congress will be going out of will be adjourning later this month and back in district for a couple of weeks and we would certainly encourage folks to if you haven't reached out to your local member of Congress, to your senators, to invite them to come visit you. I think that's probably the most powerful thing that you can do as an advocate is show policymakers what it is that you do day in and day out, the lives that you're impacting, and the difference that you're making in your communities. So we certainly encourage folks to, while your policymakers are home for the holidays and as we head into next year, we really do encourage folks to reach out to your policymakers and invite them to come to your location and see your programs and see what you're doing. And then last but not least, if you haven't signed up for our Skills Summit, this is our annual event that we hold in Washington every year, where we bring stakeholders, state and local stakeholders from across the country into Washington to advocate with policymakers about the importance of federal investments. If you haven't signed up, you can go to our website and sign up. And we really do encourage as many people as possible to come to the summit. We really do think it's important, particularly important right now, to drive home the point that we really do need to continue to invest in skills to make sure that we have the broadly shared prosperity that we need in this country. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close out the webinar, and thank you to everyone who's stuck with us a little over time. And as Katie said, we are more than happy to answer any additional questions that folks may want. You can find our email addresses on the web. I'm at kermitk@nationalskillscoalition.org. Katie is at kats@nationalskillscoalition.org. And with that, we'll go ahead and sign.